One of the things that I've spent a very long time trying to figure out is what motivated people to do the terrible things that they did in the concentration camps, particularly in the 20th century. And the concentration camp was a pretty widespread phenomenon. I mean, it's still being used extensively in North Korea, for example. And most of the population there is starving. So it's not like it's done with yet. Anyways, the best authors that I've ever read with regards to insights about the kind of totalitarian possession that leads people to commit extraordinarily brutal atrocities in the service of their belief have been, well, Solzhenitsyn, who's not normally considered a personality psychologist, but also Viktor Frankl. The reason I have you read Solzhenitsyn is because I think Solzhenitsyn is a more, I mean, Frankl's an amazing thinker, but Solzhenitsyn is one of those geniuses that comes along about every 100 years. So, and I think Solzhenitsyn wrote the most pertinent analysis of the relationship between individual cowardice and the propensity to adopt totalitarian beliefs, and then the propensity to commit acts of cruelty in the name of those beliefs. Now, it's a really tricky issue. I mean, it's commonly been assumed, for example, that people who are right-wing authoritarian people are right-wing authoritarian because they're afraid of people who aren't like them, or they're afraid of ideas that aren't like their ideas, or something like that. It's often a fear-based explanation. And it seems to me that there's something to that. You know, it's hard for me to imagine, you know, if your belief systems are disrupted by a piece of information that you don't particularly want to receive, it certainly does expose you to a tremendous amount of chaos. And so, you know, we've talked about situations, for example, where perhaps you receive the information that, you know, a loved one has been unfaithful to you or betrayed you. Now, part of what you're going to feel in relationship to that is anxiety, and it's because it destabilizes your past and all your memories, and it destabilizes your future, and it destabilizes your present, and so that presents you with a whole bunch of uncertainty, where at one point you had a pretty functional map and you knew how things related to one another and how you should act. And so it's reasonable to presuppose that that produces fear, especially because we know from work by people like Jeffrey Gray, for example, who we're going to talk about in the next lecture, that if you expose laboratory animals to novelty, which is certainly something unexpected is something novel, or something anomalous is something novel, that they react, you can conceptualize their reaction roughly in two ways, and you can say, well, they become afraid, they manifest anxiety, which you can dampen down with anti-anxiety drugs like Valium, benzodiazepines, barbiturates, and alcohol. But they also manifest curiosity, but the anxiety usually supersedes the curiosity, so the anxiety has to wear off before the curiosity will come forward, and that depends to some degree on the magnitude of the novel event, and calculating how large a novel event is turns out to be extraordinarily difficult, but we'll talk through that as well. And so the anxiety models, and so those would be things like terror management theory, for example, the anxiety models are pretty good, but they're missing things. And so here's a couple of things that they might be missing. I've pursued the idea that when you encounter a datum, we'll say, because it could be a stimulus or it could be an idea or it could be a person, but let's call it a piece of information that contradicts your axiomatic presuppositions, so your theory, then what might happen, the hippocampus is a brain area that seems to do something like detect mismatches between what you expect or want to have happen and what actually happens, and it seems to send a signal down to the reticular activating system, which is the part of your brain that actually governs consciousness. So it's what wakes you up in the morning and puts you to sleep at night, and also what makes you wake up very suddenly if you hear an unexpected noise at night. It releases the reticular activating system from inhibition, and so it's basically the hippocampus does something like tell your reticular activating system to take it easy as long as everything's going the way you want it to go. And if it doesn't go the way you want it to go, then it releases the reticular activating system from inhibition, and what that seems to do is to release a whole variety of underlying neurological circuits from inhibition. So then you become anxious, but you also become curious, but it's possible that you become a lot of other things too, and this is part of the generalized stress response as far as I can tell. And what happens when you manifest the general stress response is that your body prepares for everything. Why? Well, because you don't know what to do when something you don't expect happens. It's like the definition of not knowing what to do. And so, because your body's pretty smart, it just ramps itself up in terms of its preparation, which is very stressful, technically speaking. It's stressful because you're burning a lot of energy and resources that you could devote to other things, suppresses your immune system and gets you ready, you know. So, and you know, for any length of time, that can be fun in small doses. In fact, it is, because people like novelty in small doses, but in large doses and chronically, it's like that's death itself, you know. So it seems that people really don't like to have their expectations dashed, or more accurately, they don't like it when what they want to have happen doesn't happen, which isn't exactly the same thing. So the question is then, what does happen when what you want to doesn't happen? How exactly do you characterize it? One way of characterizing it is fear, and another way of characterizing it is something like generalized disinhibition of potential. That's another one. And I think that one's more accurate. I think it's more accurate because it's more comprehensive and it's deeper. But then there's a third variable that we're going to talk about quite a bit that everybody's just sort of coming to terms with now, which is that it turns out that people who are tilted towards right-wing authoritarianism, first of all, they're high in conscientiousness, and they're low in openness. And if you fractionate conscientiousness, which you can break it into two things. You can break it into industriousness and orderliness. And industriousness is a bang, dead-on predictor of how well you guys do in university. It's damn near as powerful as intelligence. It's not as powerful, but we can't measure it as well either. And so that's industriousness. We don't know anything about industriousness. You know, we know how to measure it through self-report, and we know how to correlate those self-reports with life outcomes. We have no neuropsychological model for it. We have no conceptual model for it. We have no pharmacological model for it. Did I say animal model? We have no animal model for it. It's like we don't know anything about it, except that it predicts long-term life success better than anything else except IQ in managerial, administrative, and academic positions, like grades. So, but orderliness, that's a whole different story. Because it turns out that orderliness, we haven't published this yet, but orderliness is associated with sensitivity to disgust. And that's a weird thing, because for a long time we thought that all the negative emotions loaded on neuroticism. So this is big five speak, fundamentally. That, you know, pain and anger, frustration, disappointment, shame, guilt, anxiety, and fear were all, if you were more likely to feel one, you're more likely to feel all of them, and all the negative emotions clumped together. And that's basically what neuroticism is from a big five perspective. But it turns out that disgust sensitivity loads on orderliness. Now I tell you, man, that is one major finding. It's like, I think, because we know a fair bit about disgust sensitivity now. Give me 1 second. That's mostly, at least in part, through the work of Jonathan Haidt, who's a very, very, very smart guy, and who started studying disgust before anybody else figured out that it was worthwhile to discuss, or to investigate, roughly speaking. You know, and he found that people who are disgust sensitive were very obsessed with moral purity. You know, it turned out to be the same thing. So bodily contamination and moral impurity are roughly the same phenomena. And then it turns out, I really figured this out when I was reading Hitler's Table Talk, because Hitler's Table Talk, by the way, was a book that was put together of Hitler's spontaneous speeches, discussion, while he was eating dinner for like 3 years. You know, it's a fascinating book, because it really gives you some insight into how he thought. And he's a very peculiar person, because he was very high in openness, which is a creativity dimension, and very high in orderliness, and people like that aren't very common. But anyways, his whole metaphor for the Aryan race, the whole metaphor was body. It's like the Aryans were a pure body with pure blood, and they were under assault from parasites. And so it was a disgust metaphor, you know, it wasn't fear. You know, it kind of sounds like fear, because you could say, well, Hitler was afraid of the gypsies, and he was afraid of the Jews, and, you know, he was afraid of non-Aryans. But, well, first of all, I don't think it's reasonable to say that the Nazis were precisely possessed by fear. That isn't exactly how they looked. And if you look at conservatives, I'm not calling conservatives Nazis, by the way, but they're, you know, the Nazi philosophy is an extension of political belief on the right, just like totalitarian communism is an extension of political belief on the left. So you can fall into a pit either